Good morning. You will see in your order of service that today's sermon is being delivered by Reverend Peter Connolly, but that's not completely accurate. There was an illness earlier in the week which postponed our planning, and we didn't quite know how it was going to come out, but everything worked in the end, except that we were not able to properly credit Natalie Johnson, who will be sharing preaching duties this morning. We had talked about this a couple of weeks ago and then met this past week. Today is we're celebrating Women's History Month, and it seemed to make sense that a woman should be involved in offering the sermon. And so we planned to talk about several aspects of women's history. And I'll talk a little bit about mostly the past, mostly about changes that occurred in our lifetime. And Natalie will talk more about the same theme in a more present-day framework. So that's what you can expect. And because we are live streaming and the camera is going to have to pan from one speaker to another, we're going to have to allow for a few seconds in between speakers. So you can expect that as well. So March is Women's History Month. And so a good time to take at least a brief look at the history of women in America, their changing social status, the cultural impact of their striving, their accomplishments, and the challenges that remain. My initial plan was simple: to look at the status of women in American society at around the time of my young adulthood, and that of many of us here, and to compare it to the status of American women today. As I looked more deeply at the topic, though, I realized that skipping over the first great victory of women, the fight for voting rights, would mean neglecting what is probably the most significant achievement in the fight for women's rights in this country. Some interesting tidbits in the history of women's suffrage and the struggle for suffrage. The first woman to vote in a political election in the United States did so in 1756. Her name was Lydia Taft, and the election was at a town meeting in Uxbridge, Massachusetts. She is described as a wealthy widow. No other woman is known to have voted in colonial America. Kentucky was the first state in the antebellum era in 1838 to pass a statewide suffrage law. That's surprising, isn't it? If you were a woman over the age of 21 and resided in and owned property subject to taxation in the common school system, you could vote. But nationally, no. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, the first women's rights convention, passed a resolution in favor of women's suffrage, even though some of the organizers felt it was too extreme. The first national suffrage organizations were established in 1869 when two competing organizations were formed, one led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and the other by Lucy Stone and Frances Watkins Harper. After years of rivalry, they merged in 1880 as the National American Woman Suffrage Association. And Susan Anthony was its leading force. In the 1870s, women from that organization tried to vote knowing that they would be turned away. Then they filed lawsuits, hoping that the United States Supreme Court would rule that as citizens, they had a constitutional right to vote. The Supreme Court ruled against them, though, in 1875. Long before women were granted the right to vote in federal elections, a number of states allowed women's suffrage. Surprisingly, all were in the far west or southwest. First, Wyoming in 1869, then Utah in 1870, then Colorado, Idaho, Washington, California, Oregon, Arizona, Montana, and North Dakota. Shades of Calamity Jane. Finally, just 104 years ago, The 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution ratified the right of women to vote. What were the obstacles faced by women in their fight for equal rights in this area? The deeply ingrained belief that woman's place is in the home and community, not in public affairs. They were believed to be naive and subject to manipulation by clever men. Some women preferred the domestic life and were glad to yield the public sphere to men. If women were allowed to vote, it would upset gender roles in other ways throughout the society. Ironically, when the 13th Amendment was passed in 1863, black men who were formerly enslaved were given the right to vote, though not without facing intimidation at the polls. Think of that. Persons formerly considered mere portable property now held a right denied to the most prosperous of women.
It is also interesting to note that many of the original suffragettes were wealthy women, either by virtue of their families or by marriage. They were also, for the most part, very well educated. Before becoming involved in the quest to obtain the vote, they initiated many social reforms, including better schools, the regulation of child labor, better working conditions for women, unionization, the campaign to regulate alcohol, and the labor movement in their spare time. Their accomplishments negate the idea that women were excessively naive and must be protected from men who might be able to manipulate them, thereby rendering their right to vote a dangerous proposition. Their contributions provide a shining example of how one can use one's privilege, whether from wealth or social advantage, for the greater good. It is human nature to punish, negate, hold down, or otherwise control those we perceive as threats to our sense of comfort or personal well-being. Since by virtue of size and strength, it is unlikely that most women pose any real physical threat to men, one must wonder at the real reason behind the historic and continued denial of equal rights. As with all people who have been oppressed or limited in their ability to thrive and flourish freely, at some point, something must change. The trajectory toward equality began in the latter part of the last century and culminated finally in the right to vote, 1 year after my own mother was born. It set in motion a long struggle that continues to this day. Women of today, especially young women, might view this as a cautionary tale, one that reminds us that rights are not simply given. Sometimes they must be fought for and won, again and again. Democracy is not static. Like anything else, it is precious. It must be carefully tended and nurtured constantly, lest it wither and die, or be stolen by those who would favor a different way of life. It is a call to be vigilant and to never allow ourselves to lapse into a false sense of security.
I grew up in the 1950s and 1960s. Though women had gained the right to vote over 30 years earlier, only 30 years, imagine that. The idea that a woman's place in the home was hardly dead and buried. I lived in a decidedly working-class neighborhood in Dorchester, where the men were the breadwinners and the women kept the home. Mr. Greeny, who lived across the street, had a full-time job of some sort, was also in the Naval Reserves, and on weekends packed ice cream for the local Brigham's ice cream shop. His wife took care of the 4 children and the home. Mr. Valeri, an Italian immigrant and our landlord, worked as a laborer while his wife kept the home and raised daughters Carmen and Gina. Mr. Campbell, across the street, supported his wife and daughter and helped support his mother, too, on one income. His wife kept the home. Every family in the neighborhood was constituted this way. My mother was the first mother I knew who worked outside the home, and that was only because of my father's tuberculosis. His disability check and meager pension from the U.S. Army were not enough to support a wife and 3 children. And my mother, an immigrant from Galway, was tied in with the expatriate Irish community, so learned of an opportunity to work as a domestic in Newton, Brookline, and Chestnut Hill, work she had done for a wealthy family in Scituate before her marriage. It was an act prompted by necessity, not an act of independence and rebellion. Things changed pretty dramatically in the 70s.
I grew up in the same time period as Reverend Peter. My dad worked for the railroad, and my mother was a homemaker by choice. My dad worked very hard to make a decent living. I would say that we were middle class. My mother loved beautiful things, and a lovely home was important to her. We could not afford the luxury of buying art or fancy furniture, so she learned to paint, braid rugs, restore and refinish furniture, and many other things so that our home looked like that of a far wealthier family. She saved money by sewing all of our clothes, favoring the latest fashions. Kids made fun of me because I looked like no one else. You don't want to be different when you're that age. But through her own talents and hard work, she was able to create the beauty and luxury she desired on my father's sufficient but unremarkable salary. Roles were very defined in those days. The man worked in a job that paid the bills and supported the family. The woman stayed home, ran the household, created and kept a budget, shopped for, planned, and cooked the meals. If there were children, the care and rearing of them fell mostly to her. The inside of the house was her domain. The outside was the man's, including the yard and any maintenance. To my mother, the perfect husband was one who made a good living and was also handy. We had a single vehicle, and 1 day a week my mother would drive my dad to work so she could have the car to do the grocery shopping and other errands. We lived within walking distance from both sets of grandparents. During World War II, men were sent off to fight, so many women took their place in factories making things for the war effort. Some women joined the WACs and learned to do maintenance on and even fly planes. For many, it was their first taste of freedom, and returning to their traditional roles after the war was difficult. If a woman wanted to work outside the home, her choices were very limited. Usually only those from wealthy families had the privilege of attending college. For most, career options were limited to secretarial, other office work, teachers of the lower grades, or nursing. Those without an education or immigrants often found work in low-paying factory jobs. Today, women can choose any career they want: doctor versus nurse, professor versus elementary school teacher, pilot versus stewardess. Once steered away from math and science, they are now encouraged to follow those disciplines. They can be anything from career military to astronauts. Today, many more young women graduate college with a bachelor's degree than do men. In 1980, 24.9% of medical school grads were women. In 2019, 47.9%. From 1950 to 1970, 3% of law school grads were women. In 2023, 39%.
I grew up in the Catholic Church in the 1950s, where I was taught this much about birth control for unmarried people: sexual abstinence. That pretty much wrapped up the issue. In the 1960s, the FDA for the first time approved a pill that made oral contraception widely available. What a whirlwind of controversy that created. The pill: women's liberation, murder in the womb, murder before there's even anything in the womb. Obviously, anything called birth control is going to be controversial. If you believe that life is sacred, and most of us do, then questions are raised when you advocate for anything that is designed to prevent the initial biological functions that lead to life. And sex outside of marriage was a sin in any event. In the religion I grew up in, and I can only assume most other Christian denominations, I remember fulminations against recreational sex and sex for sport. And I certainly do understand the position that sexual relations are a part and only a part of a healthy relationship. Sex in itself does not equate with relationship. And sexual profligacy does not lead to emotional maturity, relational maturity, unless you have a come-to-Jesus moment, such as Thomas Merton had, and reassess your behavior in a radical way. How radical were the changes that occurred in the advancement of women's rights in the United States? Up until the year I graduated college, 1974, when the Equal Credit Opportunity Act passed, women were not allowed to have bank accounts in their own name, and their husband had to sign to allow the woman to have credit. Yet in 1973, the year before, occurred Roe v. Wade, the landmark decision of the United States Supreme Court that ruled that the U.S. Constitution generally protected the right to have an abortion. What a radical change in status in what felt like overnight.
I started college in the midst of the so-called sexual revolution and the women's liberation movement of the late 60s and early 70s. I am forever grateful that when I was a teenager, there was not the peer pressure young girls face now to have sex long before they are ready. Perhaps the hormones raging in their bodies indicate they are, but emotionally it is simply not the case. Fearing the consequences of their daughters becoming sexually active at a young age, many parents start them on birth control even before their first menses. The pill may prevent most unwanted pregnancies, but it also interferes powerfully with a normal cyclical process. There are many risks involved, and the long-term consequences are still not fully known. The pill gave young women a sense of freedom from the worry of unwanted pregnancy, and it seemed to be a blessing. As long as they remembered to take it, they could enjoy intimacy without the worry. No one talked about STDs then, and the fact that the pill does nothing to protect from them. In addition, knowing that birth control was now available served to make some young men even more irresponsible than before, ultimately assuring that an unwanted pregnancy did not occur rested on women. Nothing is 100% effective, of course, and if an unwanted pregnancy did occur, 9 times out of 10, the burden of finding a solution fell to the woman as well. Some things remain the same. Regarding the current loss of Roe versus Wade, this ruling came as a shock to many, but only because no one was paying attention. Young women of today who grew up with it in place never dreamed it could be taken away. There are arguments to be made on both sides of this issue, and the divide shall remain forever. What is important, though, is that the choice should remain with the woman whose body it is. It is a decision that is terrible to make. I believe no woman ever makes it casually, easily, or without guilt. I know women from my college days who faced this and chose to end a pregnancy because they knew they could not take care of a child properly. I know women who went to a clinic with supportive friends and those who went alone. I know of women who to this day have never told another living soul of their choice and will take it to their graves. It is a lonely, heart-wrenching decision, and one that should be neither judged nor made by someone else, certainly not by someone who can never be in that predicament themselves. The loss of Roe versus Wade is a wake-up call and a cautionary tale for all in our society. It is another stark reminder that freedoms come with a price, and they must be constantly tended and protected, or they can vanish. I believe that those who originally opposed Roe versus Wade have worked diligently behind the scenes all these years, just waiting for the time when the legal support was in place and the political climate was ripe for a return to earlier control of women's bodies. Freedoms are not free, nor are they guaranteed to remain forever without our vigilance and care.
It's 2024. In most working families today, both spouses or partners work outside the home. Indeed, few families could survive comfortably on one income. The rise in the cost of homes, health care, and education especially have made two-job families, or more than two jobs, almost mandatory. A woman today earns 84 cents for every dollar a man makes. That feels like discrimination. At the same time, we need to claim progress. 5 years ago, it was 79 cents to the dollar. In 1970, about 8% of women over the age of 25 had college degrees. Today, 39% do, compared to less than 37% for men. That's significant progress. I would even say that's success. When we think about next steps, the next things we need to do as a society to ensure the continued progress of women, I think we need to broaden our perspective from the male-female polarity and to think about the success of the society as a whole. The most pressing of our domestic concerns is an existential one, I think: the survival of democracy. To ensure that, we need to be inspired by the women of the suffrage movement, not to fight for the right of women to vote, but to work together for the right of all of us to continue to have a voice that counts in national politics, in the very nature of our mode of rule. That means working to GOTV, get out the vote. The Cash in the Plate beneficiaries for the month of April are 3 organizations dedicated to getting out the vote: Workers' Circle, Working America, and the Movement Voter Project. Their missions include uniting working people who don't have a union job, working for a fair economy, and the sustainability of democracy. And I hope we will be active in other ways as well, including a letter-writing campaign, such as the one that saw such success in 2022, 2023. Are you up for doing your part to ensure the success of post-feminism, feminism? And the part that is live streamed.